Hey guys, my name is Callie. If I haven't got a chance to meet you yet, I get to serve as the Director of Media and Communications here at City. And today we're going to be in several different passages, but we're going to start out in 1 Kings 2. If you want to go ahead and get there and hang out there for a little bit, we're going to look at the last words of King David. So back in college, I read this really great book that I cannot remember the name of, so don't ask me what the name of it is, but it was good, just trust me, all right? And it was built around this concept of last words. So each chapter was titled with the last words of different people, some famous, some obscure, and the chapter would then tell you the story of each person. And so what was really fascinating to me about this book was how most last words were circumstantial. Okay, they were specific to the moment instead of definitive of the life lived. Now, I know that is a very big concept to throw at you in the first 45 seconds that I have gotten up there. So let me show you what I mean, all right? So let's start with a guy whose favorite pastime was flying kites in thunderstorms. Ben Franklin, okay, a founding father, contributor to the Declaration of Independence, that is, an inventor, a scientist who wrote a lot of profound, if not sometimes problematic, literature. You know, I assumed that he would leave this world with some pretty distinct words, right? So at the age of 84, laying in bed, his daughter told him to change position so that he could breathe more easily. And as he rolled over, he said, "A dying man can do nothing easy." So old Benny, he left the world just annoyed that he had to roll over, right? And then there's Richard Melton. He was a multi-millionaire and president of the old Alcoa aluminum plant. Alcoa, anybody? Me, great, I love that. Yes, Alcoa, go Tornadoes. On his deathbed, Richard called for his brother to come over, and he placed his hand gently on his arm and he whispered, "Last tag." Right. He and his brother Andrew, they had a 70-year-long game of tag going. And Andrew did, in fact, remain it until he died 4 years later. Now, would that not tick you off a little bit if you were Andrew? You can't, that's not fair, right? It just ruins the game of tag. And then there's Marie Antoinette. She was the Queen of France in the 1700s. She's the one who is rumored to have said, "Let them eat cake," when told of the plights of the French people. And so eventually the French revolutionaries sent her to the guillotine, and on her way across the platform, she stepped on the executioner's foot, and she said, "Excuse me, sir," and then proceeded to her death. Very polite way to go out, right? There's Nostradamus, a 16th century French astrologer and physician. He predicted, "Tomorrow at sunrise, I shall no longer be here." He was correct. He was gone. Yeah. And then there was Winston Churchill, one of World War II's most influential leaders and orators. He said on his last day, "I am bored with it all." All right. See you, Winnie. That was great. Good. Way to go out. But each of these people, they have a somewhat recognizable name, right? And each in their own way left a lasting mark on history, yet their last words were rooted more in personality than accomplishments. And with these last words, we found out more about who they were than what they did, right? So Benny, he was just obviously very cranky. And Richard, he was playful and fun. Marie couldn't be bothered. Nostradamus, weirdly certain and accurate. And then there's Winston, who, we heard it, he was just bored. He didn't want to be here anymore. So there was no recap. There was no poetic memoir that ends in this conclusion of all they've done, learned, or lived. But then we have King David in 1 Kings 2, and he let history shape his last words. But before we read them, let me give you some context here, right? Because we often hear David referred to as a man after God's own heart. Right? If you have been in the church any amount of time, you've probably heard that phrase. I remember specifically hearing it the first time, and I thought, you mean King David, right? The one who saw a woman and was like, "Oh, I want her," took her, got her pregnant, sent her husband to the front lines to be killed. I think that Jordan and Eric have painted a pretty accurate picture of King David over the past couple weeks, and none of it really seems like after God's own heart behavior, right? That's not really how I would describe him. And so while there was obviously shrapnel from his sin that impacted the lives of those around him, David recognized that ultimately his sin was firstly against a holy God. David is saying that sin is first vertical before it's ever horizontal. And here's what I want us to understand in that. If anyone could learn from history, it was David. He can see how his sin added a layer of regret to the rest of his life. His sin had ripple effects for generations. And yet, 1 Samuel and Acts, they both still describe David as a man after God's own heart. Why is that? Well, it's because David's heart was set on God. Now, I know that sounds simple, probably because it is very simple, all right? When your heart is set on God, your greatest desire is to know God, to learn the heart of God. And when your heart is not set on God, your life won't be either. Again, David is using his history. He's using hindsight to give him the foresight in these last words we're about to read. So here's David. All right, he's laying on what he knows is his deathbed. He calls in his son and the next king, Solomon, who many scholars believe is around 20 at this time. Just think about that for a second. Solomon, he's 20, right? He's in his 20s and he's about to lead this entire nation. Do you remember what you were doing when you were in your 20s? Like, I wasn't even getting up for an 8 a.m. class. And he's like, here's an entire nation for you to lead. I just can't imagine that. But if anyone needed some insight, it was Solomon at this point. Let's take a look at what happens beginning in verse 1. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Basically, we're all going to die, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, okay? And he says, you're welcome. Yeah, that was really accurate. And he says, so be strong, act like a man. Like, man up, Solomon. And I know that that's hard not to get caught up on, but contextually, many believe that David was giving that specific charge to Solomon because of his age, and also because David had seen some weak spots in Solomon up to this point, to which I would say, yeah, he's 20. There's going to be a lot of weak spots when he's 20 years old. But let's look at this next part. He says to Solomon, observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. I mean, that sounds to me like a man who had learned some lessons over life, right? It's like David's thinking, what would I tell myself at 20 years old? Which is probably why he said, be strong and act like a man, because at that point, he had already killed Goliath, right? And it does actually remind me a lot of that narrative we sometimes get from the older generation of, I walked uphill both ways without shoes in the snow to school, or, I was digging holes with a spoon for 30 cents a day when I was your age. I don't know what the holes were for. It just felt like something that worked. But David's like, Solomon, listen, you've got to toughen up. I literally slayed a giant by the time I was 20. But what I think David really wants Solomon to know here, it's what he starts with before anything else. It's pretty simple. He says, put God in his rightful place and keep him there. God has asked one thing of the Israelite people and those who lead them. He says, walk with me. David mentions it twice. He says, walk in obedience, walk faithfully. And none of it is a guessing game. God provided the how right along with the who and the why. Stay in step with the laws of Moses, which, reminder, were provided by God. So feels like a pretty easy thing to follow and to track with them. And I've got some great news, all right? Solomon does. He follows David's advice. Look at me with 1 Kings 3:3. It says, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David. And then as you keep reading in 1 Kings, you'll find God was pleased with Solomon and told him, hey, ask for anything you want. And famously, Solomon did not ask for wealth. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't ask for the ability to fly, as I would have. Instead, he asks for wisdom, for discernment to lead God's people well. He built this huge temple so that people of Israel could worship and honor God as they went about their daily lives. And as he grew older, Solomon was extremely wealthy and famous. He was settling disputes quickly, growing his family. He became a sought-out advisor that others would travel hundreds of miles to ask for advice. And many of his days, they were marked by wisdom and following the one that he had committed his life to following, until he didn't. If you'll remember from back in the spring, we talked about how the Israelites, they spent a big chunk of time conquering other people groups and settling in the land God promised them. It's worth remembering in Deuteronomy 7 that God laid out a request. Some might even call it a warning. Let's look at it. It says, "Do not intermarry with them," meaning the people whose land they had moved into. "Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods." Okay, this isn't God being ethnocentric or xenophobic. It's him trying to protect his people at a specific time in history from worshiping other gods. Seems pretty cut and dry, right? Something that the wisest man in the world could remember, probably, you would think, right? But that Deuteronomy verse that we just read, it comes back into play in 1 Kings 11. So here's Solomon, super wise, super rich, super respected and loved, super loving, maybe too loving. All right, let's read this verse. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, quite literally some of the people that God said, do not intermarry with. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Does that sound familiar? That is the Deuteronomy verse. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. I mean, listen, I am no theologian, but I could pretty confidently speculate where Solomon's wisdom became wisdom. You know, I would say maybe, that was good, right? That felt good, felt right. I would say it might have been the 700 wives. Seems problematic. But not just 700 wives, but wives from people groups that God specifically asked the Israelites not to marry into. Because God knows how easily the human heart is swayed, how the promise of love and fame and acclaim and adoration and respect can pull our attention and eventually our allegiance. And the consequence of Solomon's divided heart was a divided nation. God left one tribe, the tribe of Judah, under David's lineage, and the rest, all 11 of them, were ruled separately by men who would continually turn their hearts to gods of their own creation instead of the God of creation. So, how does this story impact our story? Well, first and most obvious, maybe just rethink any plans to marry 700 people. It's not ideal, but also, like we covered back in January, this story, the entirety of the Bible, has life-changing, eternity-shifting implications for our story, for your story. And we can look at Solomon and all of these other kings that you're going to read about in the coming weeks and say, guys, seriously, God asked you to do like one thing. It is not that hard, right? We can say, I'm not over here molding golden calves, so I feel pretty confident. But before we mark ourselves safe from building these idols in our front yards and sacrificing chickens to them, I think we need to define idols. Author and pastor Tim Keller, he gave a pretty straightforward definition of an idol. He said, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give. An idol, it's usually built over time through seemingly small decisions that lead to sacrifices in the form of time, attention, love, resources, gifting. Solomon didn't wake up and say to himself, you know what, I'm going to marry somewhere between 1 and 700 women today, and they're all going to be from the tribes that God asked us not to marry women from. My best guess is it started with a simple conversation, maybe a few. Probably started with a few minutes together here and there, attention given, probably growing into more time, more attention, more emotion, more and more, until these women had it all. Small compromises, harmless yeses spread out over time. And to put it plainly, idols grow when awareness erodes. Rarely are we building idols on purpose. And because the architecture of what we're building is so subtle, sometimes it's really hard to notice. Schedules fill, milestones marked, relationships built, professional ladders climbed until we look up and we realize that these good things have become these faux holy things in our lives, elevated and positioned to be what we look for definition and direction. So let me ask you some questions here. What, if removed, makes you unsure of who you are? Is it a relationship, a job, a title, a role, a status, influence, a place? If it was no longer a part of your life, how would you feel? Do you find security in something that can easily be taken? What comes to mind when I ask those questions? Because there's a pretty good chance that that thing is your idol. It's what most of your thoughts go toward, most of your energy, your conversations. It's what most of your anxiety and worry and drive is going toward, because idols will always cost you something. Look again at 1 Kings 11 with me, at the cost that Solomon pays, beginning in verse 9. It says, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. I think it's really interesting how often the heart is mentioned in reference to idols. Even David, with his last words, he reminded Solomon of what God's words were. He said, if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul. In all of the scriptures, God never asks for a portion of our heart. He asks for the entirety. Jesus even responds when asked by a Pharisee in Matthew 22. He said, what was the most important commandment? Is what the Pharisee asked Jesus. And Jesus responded, love the Lord your God with what? All your heart and all your soul and all your mind. So today I have to ask you, how's your heart? It makes me think of the very first verse that I memorized. So my mom used to take me to this Bible learning program called Awanas. Anybody? It was slightly terrifying because you had to memorize these huge chunks of scripture and then stand in front of this instructor and quote it back to them for, get this, a sticker. You got a sticker. That is so lame. I refuse to do it. I just would not be a part of it. But there was a woman who used to come and pick up my best friend and I when we were in high school. Her name was Tara Jo. She would pick us up and she would take us to Ruby Tuesday. Shout out brown croutons, right? That's all we like there. I'm just kidding. If you work there, we love it. But she used to take us to Ruby Tuesday and she would talk to us about Jesus. And she would tell us what it's like to live a life following Jesus. And one of the first verses that I memorized at her prompting was Proverbs 4:23. It says, guard your heart because it's the wellspring of life. She wanted us to know at 14 years old that our lives will flow out of our hearts. Every thought, every decision, direction, motivation, all of it will flow out of the posture of our hearts. So how did the wisest man in history fall to idolatry? He didn't protect his heart. Because your heart will hijack your head. How did 1 Kings describe Solomon's decision? It said, nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Solomon's heart was set on these wives, and so went his life. So what is your heart set on? The author I mentioned before, Tim Keller, he wrote an entire book on idols called Counterfeit Gods. He released it after the huge economic downturn of 2008. And essentially, Keller was saying that we, at that point, were putting all of our hope in money, sex, and fame, and making them the golden calves of that generation. And when they were snatched away, we saw a generation of hopelessness. He wrote that the majority of sin flows from putting something in God's rightful place. He gave this example. We would not lie unless first we had made something, human approval, reputation, power over others, financial advantage, more important and valuable to our hearts than the grace and favor of God. Did you catch that? To our hearts. If God is not in his rightful place, we will always struggle to know if we are in the right place. We'll find ourselves living in this constant identity crisis, unsettled, uncertain, living on whims, building up our personal empires, and idolizing what we believe it ultimately brings us. So years before coming to City, I got to serve in a role that I really loved. I led this incredible team of people. Our goals, vision, and direction were clear, and everyone was running pretty steadily in the same direction. And when I say I loved my job, I mean I really loved my job. After over a decade of being there, I started feeling unsettled. But I couldn't really put my finger on why. I mean, I loved what I was doing, my family was doing okay, I was physically pretty healthy, so what was so off? And it was around that time that I started reading 1 Kings, and then I moved into 2 Kings. And the pattern is pretty clear within these books of the Bible. A king is put in place, God says, hey, follow me, and then the king's like, no thank you, I'm going to build some idols. Each morning, as I read, this unsettled feeling continued to grow. And one day, listening to a podcast, the question was asked, what, if taken away, would leave you unsure of who you are? And I knew it immediately. It was my job. Over the following weeks and honestly months, God revealed what I had created. It was an idol. I lived on the fringes of God's work because my work came first. I was so busy becoming that I had lost complete sight of his kingdom coming, putting in extra hours, sacrificing relationships, apologizing to family for missed dinners. But I was doing a good thing. But that good thing became a defining thing. I was sacrificing my marriage, the discipleship of my children, meaningful relationships, spiritual growth, and so much more at the altar of my work. And if it was taken, my heart sped up at the thought of trying to figure out what I would do. I felt lost even at the thought of it. I remember having my first baby, Henley, and the role of motherhood overwhelmed me so much and made me so uncertain that I cut my maternity leave short so I could go back to the things that I knew how to do, the things I was confident in, the things that felt more definitive. I didn't know who I was if I was not doing this job. So I tried to negotiate with God. Anyone ever been there? You're like, okay, I hear you. Let's try this. See what you think, right? As Kent said previously, God is pretty clear about what he wants us to do with idols. He says to demolish them. But what I wanted to do in this particular season was convince God that I could partially obey his command to destroy idols. I wanted to go part-time with my work, knowing in the back of my head, eventually I'll go back to full-time. But here's the thing. Partial obedience is still disobedience. See, I thought idols were obviously bad things, when in reality, we usually really, really love and enjoy these things. It's how they become idols. So talking to a friend one day about my plan to go part-time, thinking I should get this gold star for doing it, and she was like, listen, it really seems to me like God is asking you to break up with this idol, and you're still holding its hand. And that was rude, but also true, right? And this is why you should be in a life group, no joke, is because when you can't see clearly, you have people around you who love you and love Jesus and can help you see clearly, much like Eric talked about a couple of weeks ago. But here's what I'm saying. These idols we're worshiping in the form of attention and finances and time, they aren't always obvious. Not all idols are inherently bad things. For many of us, we love these things so much because they are good things. And I think that's what confused me. I believed an idol was something terrible, yet recognizable. But the enemy, who is constantly working against us, he is just so much more subtle than that. You know, some of our idolatry may even come from an inability to trust God's pace. You know, you ask God for comfort, but it didn't feel like you thought it would. So you find comfort in numbing through scrolling, watching, drinking, eating, or any given substance. Maybe you asked God for direction, but it didn't feel clear, or it wasn't what you preferred, so you work harder for the titles, affirmation, and roles that feel more definitive. In this world, we will have feelings and wants and desires that won't immediately be met or provided for in the time frame we want. But what we have to ask is, will we love him while we wait? Will we trust him while we wait? Or will we push God to the side and replace him for the immediate, short-lasting validation or satisfaction offered by the idols we slowly build in our hearts? Because idols, they're not statues that we're worshiping in our front yards. Idols are desires we're worshiping in our hearts. And so maybe you're starting to see some form of idolization in your own life, something that you find yourself bowing your heart, your thoughts, your time, your resources, your giftings down to each day. So what do? Well, surprise, Jesus tells us exactly what to do. And honestly, this answer might feel a little too simple to you, but this is really the response that I will give to someone who's deconstructing idols and to someone who wants to be aware of when an idol is starting to form. All right, in Matthew 6:33, Jesus, he orders our lives for us. He says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." So what are you seeking? Is it marriage or relationships? Is it parenting, a new job, deep community, financial stability, joy, peace, direction? See, the danger isn't that you're going to wake up one day and start making all of your decisions in light of a relationship or in light of a job. The problem is when awareness erodes, you're going to make one small decision after another that is based on your job or that is based on a relationship. And before you know it, you're bowing your life down to an idol. And to be clear, none of these things that I listed are bad things. But when your heart is set on them, they can sit on the throne of your heart and direct your thoughts, decisions, motives, and ultimately your future. What Jesus is saying in Matthew 6 is when we're seeking God first, we can have full confidence in whatever comes next, regardless of season of life, age, circumstance, because we've situated our lives around the one thing, the one person who will never change, who will never be shaken, who will never leave. And his goal for me, his goal for you is good. It can only be good because he is good and he doesn't change. So what is your life currently situated around, honestly? Are you willing to remove what's in God's rightful place? Now, the only way to deconstruct idols consistently and keep them that way is through prayer. Now, I know you might be thinking that was a really big setup just to tell me to pray more, all right? But I do want us to rethink maybe our perspective on prayer, because our prayers are more than a desperate thing. They were never meant to be these last-ditch efforts to maybe get God to do the thing we most want him to do. They were always meant to be a conversation, a dialogue. And one of the biggest reasons we fail to pray is because we often make an idol out of self. I can do it. I can try harder. I can fix this. I can make whatever feel, go, be better. My plans matter more than my prayers. And I've heard it said that our prayer lives reflect our theology or our idolatry. Let's look at it this way. If the only thing you ever pray about is your kids, there's a decent chance your kids are your idol. If the only thing you ever pray about is your job or your career, there's a pretty good chance that success is your idol. If you only ever pray about finding a spouse, there's a chance that relationship is your idol. If you only ever pray about finances, money is most likely your idol. If you only ever pray about reputation, I would say approval is probably your idol. We put our plans and requests in front of God, and they're usually more defined by what we're actually worshiping instead of who we should be worshiping. And then we are ticked when he doesn't follow the plan, right? When he doesn't see it our way. I wonder if Solomon, felt a nudge as he married that Hittite woman or the Ammonite woman, that unsettled feeling like something is off. But because he really wanted it, he figured, well, God will get on board eventually. And here's the thing, prayer, it was never meant to be about changing God's mind. Prayer is about discovering God's heart. And putting his kingdom first means putting my kingdom last. It means I'm not settling, I'm expecting. Because when God is in his rightful place, I don't have to worry about being in the right place, hitting the right milestones, getting the right opportunities. Let's call back to King David for just a second. When reading his story and his writings, many believe he was a man who prayed 3 times a day, that he worshiped God 7 times a day. He was often resetting his heart. And look how it shaped his last words in 1 Kings, right? I mean, there has to be some correlation there between what he was doing every day and the words he wanted to leave Solomon with. What kept him as a man after God's own heart? It's that even in the midst of his biggest failures, his life-altering sin, he still pursued God. He took all of it, every bit of it, directly to God. Just read the Psalms. This isn't about pretending to be holy. This is structuring your life in such a way that you want every single moment to be known by God. The biggest successes and the biggest failures. Anything that you refuse to take to God is probably where your idols live. After God's own heart doesn't mean David always got it right. It means that regardless of getting it right or wrong, he was always pursuing God's heart. It's not the product of our days that will matter in the end. It's the prayers of our days. Because it's those prayers, that posture, submitting our hearts, our lives to God, that will define our days. I know I have asked you a lot of questions this morning, but I want to wrap up with this last question. What story do you want to tell? What do you want others to learn from your history? What do you want your last words to be, or the last words that are said about you? Honestly, if at my funeral, the most common refrain is, Callie worked really hard, and she could write a social post, and she could build a website, and she could hit every deadline, then I have let the idols win in my life. It means I didn't seek first the kingdom of God. It means I was building my own kingdom the whole time. I hope that my last words, I hope the last words that are said about me sound a little more like her husband always knew how much she loved him. And her kids, they know Jesus better because of her. They know how to love because they were loved well. And man, did she want people to know Jesus and to feel seen and heard and cared for. Those are the last words I want. I want all of my days to be defined by Jesus' last words on the cross. It is finished. I can work all I want. I can chase all I want. I can bow down to all I want. I can get every title, every dollar, every relationship that I want, and none of it, not one thing, not one part, will rival the power, authority, and confidence available to me and available to you because of those last words. It is finished. And it's because of those words I'll submit my life to following Jesus. No idol can do what he did for me. No idol can love me the way he loves me. No idol will understand me the way he understands me. No idol will comfort, encourage, or defend me the way he does. A divided heart is a defeated heart. So today, whether you follow Jesus or not, will you ask yourself, does he have my whole heart? And can I invite you to give it to him? If you're a follower of Jesus and you recognize this morning that you've given pieces of your heart or the throne of your heart to something, to anything else, let this time of communion be the time you remember who Jesus is and the sacrifice he made so you wouldn't have to live defeated or divided. And if you're not a follower of Jesus and you want to know about this wholeness that we're talking about, this ability to live in the confidence of the finished work of the cross, we'll have incredible prayer team volunteers at the front who want to walk you through what it means to trust Jesus. Or maybe you know of an idol in your life that you want to lay down. I want to invite you to do that today. This is your opportunity to say, I will not live with a divided heart. God's asking for my whole heart, and I will give him the entirety of it this morning. Let's pray.